Making her way majestically among the neatly lined living corridor of servants, Lady Grace Winston embodied the image of austerity and grandeur that the daughter of a duke, whose name is weighty in the imperial halls, should possess. She didn't just walk, she hovered above the floor with her gaze, scanning the order her ancestors had established and now seemed to have broken. Her eyes, sharp and attentive, were like two beacons in the fog that reflected not only the nobility of her origins, but also the steadfastness of her decisions. Turning to the butler, whose name was as well known among the servants as her own among the aristocracy, Lady Grace did so with such stiffness and determination that even the air around her seemed to thicken. Her words about the mess in the house she considered her sanctuary were filled not only with frustration, but a demand for immediate action. There was a sense of power in her voice, backed not only by being born into a noble family, but also by the personal qualities of a leader nurtured from childhood. After all, she was not just an aristocrat, she was the only daughter of a duke whose place was near the highest echelons of power in the empire. From birth, she was destined to possess everything she could dream of. But Grace Winston saw it not only as a privilege, but also as a burden of responsibility to her name and heritage. She knew that her every action, every word was weighed and analyzed, and so she strove to maintain order and perfection in everything worthy of her status. This pursuit of her ideal reflected not only her personal will, but also a deep understanding of what was expected of her as the highest level of the aristocracy, directly connected to the imperial family. In addition to her undeniable nobility and desire for order, Lady Grace Winston possessed another outstanding trait, an unyielding strength of mind and body that allowed her to stand up for the defense of those she felt needed protection, even if it meant confrontation. Her determination and willingness to act was proven during one memorial event that became legendary among the aristocracy. At the birthday party of the heir to the throne, when the entire imperial elite gathered to celebrate this important event, Grace unexpectedly showed not only her noble fortitude, but also her fighting spirit. It happened that she came into conflict with 17 nobles, defending the honor and dignity of those she considered unjustly insulted. This act, although dictated by high motives, caused widespread resonance among the aristocracy and greatly distressed her father, Duke Winston. His despair was so great that he saw fit to send Grace to a remote region for a year, hoping that this time would allow her to rethink her actions and return home with a peaceful heart and a cleansed mind. This act of exile was not easy for anyone, neither for Grace, who had to leave her home and familiar life, nor for her father, who, despite the severity of the decision, suffered from the separation from his beloved daughter. Despite the ordeal her father put her through by sending her into exile, Grace could not find the strength to accept the blame for what had happened. On the contrary, it only fueled the flames of resentment in her heart toward her father, making the rift between them even deeper. Far from her native home, in the remote region to which her fate had thrown her, Grace did not allow herself to become discouraged or give up in the face of hardship. With indomitable energy and a strong determination to prove her worth, she immersed herself in her work, turning punishment into an opportunity for growth and self-development. Her days were filled with tireless labor and the pursuit of excellence, which no doubt left an indelible mark on her character. Grace's return to her native home was marred by an unexpected discovery that awaited her at home. From the butler, who has always been something of a bridge between daughter and father, Grace learns of an event that radically changes the family dynamic and adds new layers of complexity to an already tangled relationship. Her father, Duke Winston, not only remarried, but did so to a woman who was not only a dancer but the object of his longtime passions. The revelation that this woman had gotten the Duke pregnant 20 years ago and was now back in his life came as a real shock to Grace. This dancer, as it turned out, was none other than a former duchess whose existence and connection to her father had been unknown to her until that moment. The complexity and ambiguity of the situation added gravity to the already difficult relationship between Grace and her father. This discovery not only expanded the boundaries of her understanding of her family's past, but also prompted her to rethink many aspects of her life and relationships within her family. Grace was racked with a sense of deep disappointment and confusion as she learned of the secrets her father had kept from her. He never mentioned his new wife, anxious to avoid any conflict or dramatic scenes that might break out if Grace learned the truth too soon. However, the real blow for her came when she suddenly noticed that the house, their family nest, was decorated with symbols that belonged to their sworn enemies. This discovery struck her like a thunderclap, for such a decision had been made at the behest of her father, a man who, she thought, had always stood by the family and its traditions. Madame Merrill, the new head maid, said with an adamant look that Grace had no reason to question the decision. She stood like an impregnable fortress, ready to repel any objection. But Grace was not one to back down easily. She felt that breaking the traditions and symbols of their home was a betrayal too great to silently accept. With fire in her eyes and unwavering confidence in her voice, Grace spoke out against Madame Muriel, declaring that tulips, symbols of their enemies, were an impermissible decoration for their home. These flowers, in her eyes, were more than just plants. They were a sign of disrespect for her family's history and heritage, a disregard for the ties that bound their generations together. This moment was a spark ignited in the darkness, highlighting the rift between the old traditions and the new order of things that was trying to establish itself in their home. Grace knew the fight would not be easy, but she was willing to stand up for her beliefs and protect her family's history, even if it meant confronting those closest to her. In the very heart of the enemy empire rose the House of Manaska, symbolized by the tulip. This symbol, which had been a sign of power and opposition for centuries, was now brazenly displayed right in front of Grace's eyes in her own home. Facing such a challenge, Grace could not remain indifferent. She dutifully stated that she had every right to express her dissatisfaction with the decision. After all, how could Madame Muriel, a maid who still hadn't even bothered to introduce herself properly, try to tell her what emotions to feel or what opinions to express? Grace realized that her struggle in this house would not only be against her father's imperioususness and insolence, but also against the new maid, Madame Muriel, who seemed to have already taken a position of hostility. The situation was heating up, and the air in the room grew heavier with tension. Madame Muriel, for her part, found herself in a quandary, unable to find words to answer Grace's strong and bold declarations. Her silence was loud. It expressed her inability to resist the arguments of Grace, who, contrary to expectation, was a much stronger and more strong-willed person than she had originally supposed. This moment was a turning point in the history of their family, symbolizing the beginning of an era of struggle and confrontation within the house itself, where every symbol and every word had a deep meaning, and the clash of beliefs and views promised to flare up with renewed vigor. Grace, on the brink of this conflict, was determined to stand up for her principles and protect the values of her home, even if it meant confronting those who were supposed to be her new family. Grace discovered that the fate of her faithful maid, Aliona, had taken an unexpected turn. Instead of quietly and diligently attending to her duties in Grace's cozy quarters, Aliona had been transferred to the stables. This decision was made at the strict behest of Grace's father, a man whose words and wishes were law in their home. However, Grace, a daughter endowed not only with beauty but also with an indomitable will, could not tolerate this turn of events. She was firmly convinced that everyone should mind their own business, and Aliona's place was by her side, not among horses and saddles. With this unshakable certainty in her heart and soul, Grace, without considering the possible consequences, decided to act. She set herself the task of restoring justice and returning Aliona to her usual duties. In her determination, she even confronted her own father, the head of the family, whose decision was rarely challenged. Grace pulled herself together and, determined to demonstrate her strength of character, headed for her father's office. Stepping into the very office where all of their family's key decisions were made, Grace was met with a cool and reserved reception. Her father, a man who always kept his emotions under tight control, met his daughter with a dry greeting that didn't suggest an easy conversation. But Grace was not ready to back down. Her eyes glistened with an unruly flame, and her soul was determined to stand up for justice and give Aliona back the place she deserved. Grace looked around her father's study, where every object and every painting on the walls seemed to bear witness to the many decisions made here. Grace stopped her gaze at the new portraits. They depicted her new stepmother and her daughter, hanging among other family heirlooms as symbols of a new era in their family's history. These portraits seemed foreign and intrusive to Grace in this old and respected house, filled with the history and traditions of her own family. She demanded an explanation from her father, for each new change in their home seemed to her more and more mysterious and disturbing. Yet her father, the Duke, the man whose word was law in their home and beyond, showed no desire to share his thoughts or plans. His eyes were unyielding, and silence became a fortress wall separating father and daughter. Suddenly, as if out of the blue, the Duke made an accusation against Grace, saying that she, just like her exiled mother, carried the seed of evil within her. These words struck Grace like a stab in the back, for to accuse her of supposedly sharing the blame with her mother was to her the height of injustice. Grace, in spite of all the storms of emotion in her soul, found the strength to reply. She said that her father was hypocritical in turning a blind eye to his own faults, preferring to blame others instead of facing the truth. Grace was willing to reconcile and apologize to her stepmother if she had been guilty of any wrongdoing, but she was also firm in her decision. If she was not to blame, her father would have to apologize. When the door swung open, they were faced with an unexpected sight. Grace's new sister caught eavesdropping on the conversation outside the door. Grace's gaze was filled with seriousness as she looked at Katia, who seemed to be gripped with consternation. That moment filled the room with tension, as if electricity was vibrating in the air, foreshadowing the coming storm. The father, reacting with lightning speed, jumped to his feet. His first reaction was not anger or annoyance at Grace's sudden invasion of the family's privacy, but deep concern for Katia's condition. His gaze, full of anxiety, quickly assessed her, trying to see if her frightened state had done her any harm. Will she be able to stand up? Did she hurt herself in the fall? These questions seemed to flicker through his mind as he simultaneously expressed his disapproval of Grace's action. Scolding Grace for her carelessness that could have led to Katia's downfall, her father didn't hide his disappointment. "How could you let this happen?" His words, though addressed to Grace, sounded more like a plea for responsibility to everyone involved. In this moment, the dynamics of family relationships were revealed, where concern for the well-being of each family member came first, even if it meant a momentary surge of emotion and anxiety. The moment Grace, deciding she'd had enough of being involved in this tense scene, turned to leave. But suddenly Grace was confronted by new stepmother Milena, who was standing right in the doorway. With a smile lighting up her face, Milena apologized for the somewhat chaotic and unexpected entry into their lives, as well as for Katia's display of curiosity that had provoked the current misunderstanding. The father, for his part, declared with dignity and confidence, as if trying to strengthen the foundations of the family hearth, that Milena and Katia were now integral members of their family, emphasizing their importance and place in everyone's hearts. It was said with the hope that such a confession would help break down the walls of misunderstanding and bring them all together. Grace, however, seemed unable to accept this new image of the perfect family that her father was trying to paint before her eyes. Mixed feelings were still raging in her heart, and perhaps the feeling of losing something very important and personal was keeping her in suspense. Once again deciding to leave, despite her father's best attempts to smooth things over, she confirmed her intention with actions, which only increased her father's anger and frustration. This moment was another turning point in the complex process of adaptation and mutual understanding within the family, where everyone was trying to find their place and way of communicating with the new family members. The tension between Grace and the rest of the family emphasized the depth of emotion and complexity of experience they were all feeling at this moment in time. In the privacy of her room, where darkness served as protection from the outside world, Grace found herself deep in thought. She pondered how her father had been able to change their family life so drastically during the period of her absence, which had lasted only a year. Not only had he rejected her mother, but he had found himself a new life partner, an act that seemed unfathomable and even treasonous to Grace. Thoughts of Milena and Katia, who may have also been dragged into this situation without their desire and may have been victims of circumstances rather than their creators, especially victims of her father's decisions, flashed through her mind. Grace realized that it was probably unfair to blame them for the changes that had taken place. However, she also realized that letting anger and resentment rule her now would not be the best decision. At this moment in time, it was important for her to gather her thoughts and decide how to proceed. In an attempt to find answers, Grace crouched down deep in thought. She was looking for ways to help her not only cope with her current situation, but perhaps find a way to rebuild lost connections within her family or learn to live with these new changes without losing herself. In this silence filled only with her own thoughts and emotions, Grace searched for the strength to accept what had happened and to determine what steps to take next to find her way through the maze of circumstances. Deciding not to interfere with the newly established family arrangements by letting them play family. Grace had resigned herself to the idea that her future as a duchess was already sealed, and it gave her some peace of mind. Her morning began with a pleasant surprise when she was awakened by Aliona, the faithful maid, whose joy at being reunited with Grace was unspeakably great. Aliona did not hide her delight at having the honor of serving her mistress again, for it had been a whole year since they had last met. She noticed that Grace had lost a considerable amount of weight during the separation, which made her anxious and compassionate. Grace, for her part, also felt the joy of seeing Aliona. It was a reminder of her former life, something familiar and comforting in the new reality that surrounded her. The mutual affection and understanding between Grace and Aliona was unchanged despite all the changing circumstances. Starting her day in such a positive way, Grace set about her morning preparations, encouraged not only by her meeting with Aliona, but also by the prospect of a new day. This moment reaffirmed her decision to put all the controversy and discomfort of family changes behind her and move forward with the pride and dignity that characterizes a future duchess. She was ready to face the challenges ahead while maintaining her identity and values. Excitement swept over Grace as thoughts of Madame Muril's possible actions regarding her food began to swirl through her mind. However, Aliona quickly dispelled these doubts, confidently informing that she did not leave the stove during the cooking, carefully observing every movement and ingredient. This should have calmed Grace, but peace was not yet restored to her soul. There was tension inside the manor, which soon took a new turn. Grace, feeling the weight of responsibility for the order of her house, decided to take drastic measures. With a serious expression on her face, she announced her intention to dismiss some of the servants. The reason for such a decision was the reigning disorder in the estate, which, in her opinion, was unacceptable for such a noble house. In addition, Madame Muril's behavior left much to be desired, adding fuel to the fire. When it seemed that the atmosphere could not get any more tense, Aliona, as if not wanting to break the silence, but feeling the need to share important information, interrupted her. Her voice sounded uncertain as she relayed the rumors spreading among the servants. The message concerned Grace's father and a possible change in the line of succession to the duchy. Those words hung in the air, adding new shadows of doubt and betrayal to an already complicated situation on the estate. Grace, whose heart was darkened by grave distress, felt an urgent need to find an ally to support her in her fight for justice. She decided that there was no better way to accomplish this goal than to go directly to the heart of the empire, the princess herself. To this end, Grace, gathering all her resolve, requested an audience with the princess, whose power and favor could be a beacon of hope to her in the dark waters of despair. On the day of the meeting, when the sun was just beginning to illuminate the majestic halls of the imperial palace, the princess, showing an incomparable nobility of soul, canceled the planned hunt with the emperor to give time to Grace. It was a gesture that would soften even the hardest heart, for such attention to the problems of the common man was not a common occurrence in the circles of the highest nobility. Upon meeting, the princess, as if reading Grace's mind, immediately expressed her understanding of the situation by mentioning Grace's mother's act, which she called unforgivable. It was like a cold shower for Grace, for she was convinced that her mother would never do such a thing. Grace's answer was full of determination and confidence. She defended her mother's honor by saying that she could not have done such a thing. With a heavy heart, but with indomitable determination in her eyes, Grace approached the princess with a statement that would change the course of their conversation. She expressed the thought that if her mother had really wanted to get rid of Milena and Katia, the two souls would have long ago left this world, disappearing into the vortex of oblivion. Grace emphasized that her mother had such determination and precision in her actions that even the thought of a mistake or misstep would have been foreign to her. It was a statement not only of her mother's innocence, but also of the strength and will to act if she really wanted to. The princess, for her part, found herself in a quandary. She recognized that without more conclusive evidence, it would be difficult for her to initiate any investigation into the matter. It was like a verdict for Grace, who looked to the princess not only as an ally, but also as a hope for justice. However, despite the obstacles, Grace did not lose her spirit. She revealed to the princess another important point that was the reason for her coming. Her father, standing on the threshold of a decisive step, was going to change the order of succession in the kingdom, choosing a new heiress. This turn of events carried not only personal drama for Grace, but also the potential future of the entire kingdom, for a change in the line of succession could lead to unpredictable consequences. In that moment, her words sounded like a call to action, reminding us that justice and truth must be the basis of every decision, even if the path to them is thorny and full of trials. With the unbending confidence and dignity characteristic of a true descendant of the great Winston family, Grace uttered the words that were to convince the princess of her sincerity and dedication. She declared herself a true representative of her home, putting the full force of her heritage and personal determination into those words. Grace emphasized that her request for support was not a frivolous or narcissistic wish. It was an appeal for justice and support in a time of need, based on deep historical and personal ties to the princess. The princess, for her part, could not remain indifferent to such a manly and open confession. The boldness and determination with which Grace expressed her thoughts and feelings reminded her of the times when, from her earliest childhood, Grace had shown a steadfastness of spirit and a willingness to stand by the side of the princess. These qualities had always been admired by the princess, and now, hearing them again, she couldn't help but recognize the deep bond that connected them. In response to such a powerful message from Grace, Princess expressed her support, albeit cautiously, but sincerely stated her hope for Grace to win this hard-fought battle. These were not mere words of comfort or empty promises. They were an acknowledgement that the princess saw in Grace not only a daughter of her own kind, but a person capable of overcoming any obstacle for the sake of justice and truth. In that moment, through the princess's words, there was more than just encouragement. It was an expression of deep faith in the ideals they both shared and in the unyielding fortitude to overcome the toughest challenges. As the shadows covered the spacious corridors of the imperial palace, Grace, absorbed in thinking about her recent dialogue with the princess and the future she sought to build, suddenly found herself face to face with a mystery. In the labyrinths of power, where every step could mean a new twist of fate, she stumbled upon a stranger whose presence here seemed as inexplicable as it was unsettling. His sudden appearance in such a place caused Grace a mixture of surprise and suspicion, for not everyone could move so freely and stealthily through the sacred halls of the imperial house. The encounter with the stranger made Grace forget her intentions and worries for a moment. She wondered why he wandered so casually and boldly through the corridors that were only accessible to a select and trusted few of the Empire. Her question sounded like a challenge, for anyone who was here had to have a good reason or permission. There was no answer, however. Instead of an explanation or an attempt to justify himself, the stranger demonstrated something incredible that made Grace's heart sink with astonishment and alarm. With a few quick movements that seemed to be part of an ancient and powerful ritual, he disappeared right before her eyes, leaving only a slight swirl in the air, as if confirming his magical disappearance. This act of magic, so abrupt and unexpected, left Grace in a state of deep amazement and questions that were about to be answered. Such a counter-event in the corridors of the imperial palace not only added mystery to Grace's already accumulated worries, but also reminded her that there was much more than apparent power and intrigue lurking within these walls. After her unexpected encounter with the stranger who had used magic to disappear without a trace right before her eyes, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of unease and excitement. Her thoughts hovered around this encounter, for the calmness and confidence with which that fellow was possessed was not only strange, but suspicious. Reflecting on what had happened, she came to the conclusion that it might be worth notifying the knights to take action and secure the palace. Absorbed in these thoughts, Grace returned to the family estate, where she was greeted by an unusual sight. The servants, who were usually disciplined and orderly, seemed extremely tense. Anxiety hung in the air, and it was obvious that there was chaos here, disrupting their usual routine. Grace immediately sensed that something had gone wrong, and her premonitions were only heightened when she noticed the absence of Alyona, one of the maids who had always been loyal to her and her family. Concerned, Grace decided to find out where Alyona was and turned to the servants for information. The answer she received only increased her anxiety. Madame Muriel, the strict and imperious woman who had assumed the role of tutor and orderly in the house, was now instructing Alyona. This answer hinted that Alyona might be in an unpleasant situation, perhaps even in danger, given the methods of edification to which Madame Muriel sometimes resorted. Grace felt anger and determination overwhelm her as she met the resistance and uncooperative nature of the maids. She realized that Madame Merrill, using her power, might have overstepped her bounds by beating Alyona in the garden, which was totally unacceptable. Grace demanded that Merrill be brought to her immediately to clarify the circumstances of what had happened and to settle once and for all the question of Merrill's continued stay in their house. The maid's reply that Merrill was busy only added fuel to the fire, for Grace could not allow this treatment of the people who worked for them to continue. With her declaration that since Meryl was so busy she should be spared the extra work forever, while chasing away the pushy maids covering up her actions, Grace showed her determination and willingness to take drastic measures. This was a clear message to all who worked in the house that she would not tolerate any form of violence or injustice against those under her protection. She was willing to take responsibility for order and justice in her home, even if it meant making unpopular decisions. This moment tested Grace not only as the daughter of the homeowner, but also as a leader capable of making decisions in difficult situations, ensuring the protection and well-being of all those under her wing. It has shown that it is ready to fight for the rights and dignity of its people, even if it requires drastic measures. On that fateful day, as the sun rose over the manor house, enveloping it in its warm light, Grace decided to go to the garden to settle her differences with Madame Morrill in person. She couldn't even imagine witnessing a scene so shocking that her heart froze in her chest with horror. Meryl sat in front of Aliona, the young maid whom Grace had grown to love like a sister. Her eyes blazed with fury and her hand came down mercilessly with a lash across Aliona's body. Mariel's words were as cold and cruel as ice. She argued that regardless of Grace's return, Aliona must remain in the stables, her true place in Mariel's opinion. Aliona, however, in spite of the painful blows, boldly met Meryl's gaze and declared that Lady Grace, as heiress of the house, had the right to decide where her place should be, and that her word should be law to all under the roof of the house. Meryl, however, did not take these words, but became even more angry and swung the whip again, saying that Grace had lost her father's favor and her will had no place here. This scene, filled with despair and struggle for justice, reflected not only the personal tragedies of the characters, but also the complex relationships between the servants and the aristocracy of the time. At the moment when the whip, like a wing of fate, fluttered back into the air, heralding a new wave of pain for Aliona, Grace couldn't stand it. Her voice, full of determination and authority, cut through the tense silence of the garden. She had made it clear to Meryl that the consequences would be imminent and extremely unpleasant for her if she did not stop her actions. Grace's words sounded like a verdict that could not be challenged. Meryl, though she was known for her stubbornness and determination, felt the gravity of the situation at that moment. She realized that to resist the will of the heiress of the house would mean disaster for her own position on the estate. With a sigh that mingled disappointment and recognition of her defeat, Meryl stopped, and the lash came down without reaching its target. Grace, whose emotions were on edge, made another gesture full of symbolism and power. She stepped closer to Meryl and, with a bold and decisive movement, pushed the chair so that it hit Meryl's leg. It was not just a physical action, but a clear message that Grace would not tolerate any violence against those under her protection. Then, turning to the maids, who, frozen with horror and amazement, had witnessed the whole scene, Grace ordered a chair to be raised for her and sat down in it with the dignity and majesty proper to a true heiress. Her actions and words not only stopped the beating, but showed everyone present that justice and concern for her subjects came first for her. In response to Grace's defiant challenge, Meryl, without losing the sharpness of her tongue, accused her of behavior she felt was only worthy of criminals. Grace, however, undaunted by her inherent calmness and even humor, only laughed in the face of this accusation. With unwavering confidence and a slight irony in her voice, she challenged Meryl, asking if she was going to apply her methods of punishment to the criminal Grace herself or take on a task impossible even for her, kicking her out. Meryl, whose indignation was only growing, declared that she intended to bring everything to the Duke's ears, confident of her right to punish Aliona for breaking the established rules. She stood her ground, emphasizing that she had every reason to take drastic measures against Aliona. But Grace, not about to back down, demanded the whip from Mariel with iron determination. By this action, she not only defied Meryl, but emphasized her unwavering right to protect those in her care and punish those who abused their position. Grace demonstrated not only her power and influence, but also her willingness to be a shield for those in need of protection, even if it meant confronting the established routines of the house. As time seemed to stand still awaiting a decision, Grace sat motionless, her gaze fixed on Madame Morrill. At this moment, every second stretched into an eternity. The air was filled with tension. Madame Morrill, surrounded by an aura of hesitation, seemed frozen in place, weighing the pros and cons. Grace, with an unwavering expression on her face, watched her every movement carefully, noting in her mind that instruments of the kind of whip most often found their use in the treatment of animals. The thought made her heart clench with pain and indignation, for to use such a cruel method on Aliona seemed to her the height of injustice. When Madame Maril finally held out the whip to Grace with a heavy heart, the atmosphere around her seemed to lighten a little. Grace, upon accepting it, immediately shared her unwavering life principle of giving everyone 3 chances. She looked directly into Meryl's eyes, emphasizing the seriousness of her words, and informed her that of the 3 chances she had been given, 2 had already been irretrievably wasted. This statement made Meryl freeze, realizing the depth of the situation and the possible consequences of her further actions. Grace's next action came as a complete surprise to everyone present. The strength and determination with which she broke the whip was so great that it instantly transformed the room, filling it with a sense of power and unwavering will. By destroying the symbol of oppression and cruelty, Grace made her message clear. Any mistake made a 3rd time would have irreparable consequences. Her words that Meryl would be stripped of her head the next time she made a blunder sounded not like a threat, but like a nonchalant promise coming from someone whose principles and decisions could not be challenged. This act not only demonstrated her rejection of cruelty, but also emphasized the steadfastness of her decisions and her willingness to defend justice at all costs. A tense scene unfolded in the labyrinthine castle corridors where Grace, the epitome of fortitude and steadfastness, stood before Aliona, who seemed shrouded in an aura of confusion and uncertainty. Strictly but fairly, Grace expressed her disapproval at the way Aliona had allowed her dignity to be hurt. In Aliona's heart, there was anxiety not so much for her own position as for Grace's welfare, for the rumors floating in the air about Grace's mother could hit her reputation with no less force than a hurricane. Grace's reflections on the situation were deep and penetrating. She concluded that Meryl, who had behaved with such unwarranted arrogance, clearly felt a strong support behind her, or she would not have dared to behave in such a manner. Aliona, seeking to smooth out the sharp edges of the conflict, suggested a path of reconciliation through an apology to the Duke. Grace, however, showing the firmness of her principles and pride, rejected the idea. Instead, she chose the path of diplomacy and strategy, ordering a letter to Count Luxon in hopes of restoring and strengthening ties with Lady Valyria, which was a much wiser and considered decision in this situation. Thus, in this castle episode, the interweaving of feelings, aspirations, and decisions reveals the complexity of the relationships between the characters, their inner world, motives, and values. Just as blades are best told by a blacksmith and medicines by a physician, so when it came to rumors, one had to go to Lady Valyria. Against the softly lit square, where every object seemed filled with secrets and stories of the past, Grace waited to meet Lady Valyria. In her thoughts flashed the certainty that Valyria, known for her love of theatricality, would certainly want to surprise her with her appearance, turning the moment of meeting into a real performance full of drama and emotion. When Valerie finally showed up, her actions didn't take long. She literally rushed to Grace, enveloping her in an embrace from which tears and accusations leaked out. Valerie's words were filled with reproach for Grace's failure to find an opportunity to write to her during her period of exile. This outburst of emotion and accusations was aimed at reasserting herself as a devoted friend, craving attention and care. Grace, standing in front of Valerie, inwardly remained unbending and calm, for she understood perfectly well the true nature of what was happening. These accusations, though they sounded sharp, were really only part of the mask Valyria had chosen for herself in this world of conspiracies and intrigue. Grace realized that such words carried no true judgment or pain, but were more a way of supporting the image Valerie had so carefully constructed for herself. This moment of encounter between 2 women so different yet connected by a complex network of relationships reflected not only their personal stories, but also the complexity of the emotional entanglements inherent in high society, where every word and gesture could have hidden undertones and motives. As they entered the spacious living room filled with the soft light of the morning sun, the atmosphere seemed weightless and carefree. But behind this semblance of calmness, there were deep feelings and complex reflections. Valyria, with a slight sigh of fatigue, could no longer hide her true state of mind. She shared her experiences with Grace, admitting to having a hard time carrying the burden of the image she created. This image, which she had been forced to maintain over the years, had become a source of exhaustion for her. Valyria noted that her decision to invite Grace was dictated not only by the desire to spend time in the company of a friend, but also to avoid spreading bad rumors. After all, in the eyes of the public, his and Grace's relationship looked like a model of perfect friendship, where they were depicted as white and red Adelita roses, symbolizing harmony and mutual understanding. For others, their union represented an ideal of friendship, where each of the girls complemented the other, creating together a unique whole. However, for Valyria, this image was only a mask, behind which she hid her true feelings and interests. Ever since she was a child, she had to pose as someone else, so as not to arouse suspicion or become a threat to the heir, showing complete indifference to family affairs. This role was a heavy burden she carried for years, trying to protect her true self from prying eyes. Instead of family matters, Lady Valyria was simply building political power by building up the right connections, pretending to be nothing more than a naive girl. When Grace, with a noticeable concern in her voice, asked Valyria to share everything she knew about Milena and Katia, tension hung in the air. Valyria instantly caught the hidden meaning in her words, realizing the depth of her friend's concern. Grace was gripped with anxiety over the real possibility of Katia becoming heir to the duchy, feeling that her father was becoming increasingly distant from her, prioritizing his new family. This change in attitude caused Grace to feel vulnerable and uncertain about her future. In response, Valyria shared the little she knew about Milena. Rumors about her were spreading among high society, many of them unflattering. However, as Valyria pointed out, the imperial family personally asked her to help dispel the unkind rumors surrounding Milena. It was a sign of trust and respect for Valyria, as well as an indication of her influence in high places. She felt the weight of responsibility, realizing that her actions could significantly affect society's perception of Milena and possibly change the course of events in the future. Katia, whose name was known in the highest circles of society, attracted attention for her unusual activity among the aristocracy. However, contrary to expectations, her social circle was not limited exclusively to nobles. She preferred the company of lesser-known nobles, and sometimes even people without aristocratic titles. This choice caused quite a bit of controversy and rumors among the upper classes, many of whom could not understand Katia's motivation in ignoring the attention from more powerful and noble suitors. Although she was proposed to even by knights, she invariably turned them down, showing no interest in marriage or aspirations to be the heiress of an influential house. Grace made a request of Valerie. She asked her to dig through the archives and look into a case that had shadowed her family for 20 years. It was about a lawsuit that her mother had been accused of. The case was hushed up and forgotten, particularly because the Duke, the head of the family, showed no interest in reviving or investigating it. Grace was filled with mixed feelings as she pondered her father's role in the story of the court case that tarnished their family's reputation. She was angered by her father's blind crush, which she felt caused him to choose to turn a blind eye to the accusations against their family, ignoring the opportunity to clear their name. Grace was convinced that rumors about her family's past should have spread throughout high society by now, and it was Valerie who could be the key to unlocking those secrets. Grace's confidence in Valyria's ability to help was not accidental. She saw Valyria not only as an ally, but also as a skillful player in the complex game of social relations. Grace's promise was generous and tempting. She offered Valerie a plan that would not only help her uncover the secrets of the past, but would also provide Valerie with a substantial income. This money could have greatly improved Valyria's standing in society, enhancing her reputation. Valerie's task seemed simple at first glance, but it required special tact and skill. By talking to various people, she had to find out information that could shed light on the Grace family's case. All Valyria had to do was to conduct conversations in such a way that her interlocutors did not suspect the true purpose of these meetings. Valyria was then to pass on any details she learned accidentally to Grace. This plan required not only Valyria's charm and communication skills, but also her ability to unobtrusively identify information that could help Grace. Valyria, who voiced her agreement to the proposal with interest, couldn't help but wonder what kind of earning Grace had in mind. However, it turned out that Grace had not yet developed a concrete plan of action. Despite this, with confidence and steadfastness in her voice, Grace assured Valerie that their journey to success together would be made even more interesting by this uncertainty. Grace warned, not without irony, that if Valyria couldn't do her part, Grace's revenge would be quite subtle. In response, Valyria, with a slight laugh and a playful glint in her eyes, expressed her pleasure at such a risky promise, showing her readiness for the unexpected and possible challenges. It wasn't long before Grace received an invitation to dinner, which she was clearly reluctant to accept. This dinner represented another test in their unpredictable journey. promising new challenges and perhaps unexpected twists and turns in their already tangled history. That evening, as the warm light illuminated the family's dining room, Grace felt a taut string of foreboding in the air. She was almost certain that the reason for the gathering around the table was Madame Muril's tireless complaints, which seemed to have been flying at Grace for too long. The atmosphere was saturated with anticipation of a conversation that would resolve all the resentments that had accumulated. When Grace's father suddenly erupted, his voice, full of indignation, cut through the silence. He expressed his indignation at what he called his daughter's haughty behavior, who, in his opinion, had been shamelessly meeting with a friend after allegedly abusing the servants. Grace, remaining an oasis of calm in the epicenter of the family whirlwind, gently objected that she had no idea of any bullying. She remarked earnestly that she did not remember that there had ever been such an incident, that her words were full of bewilderment and pure-hearted confusion. But her calm and poised response only added fuel to the fire of her father's anger. His fist struck the table with sudden force, making a sound that would have made your ears ring. The gesture was full of determination and authority, and the voice with which he shouted at Grace reflected the depth of his frustration and displeasure. This moment epitomized the tension that had built up in the family, and the dinner conversation turned into a moment of truth, where every word and every action took on weight, and the atmosphere in the house became even more tense and anxious. Milena, assuming the role of peacemaker in this outbreak of family conflict, tried to bring clarity to the heated situation. She approached the Duke to calm his indignation, choosing her words carefully. Milena said that the basis for Madame Muril's complaints was Grace's behavior the day before, which Merrill assessed as a display of anger. Grace, however, did not hesitate to answer, revealing circumstances presented in an entirely different light. She expressed that Merrill had actually been aggressive towards her personal maid, which was a shocking revelation to the entire family. At Grace's words about Merrill's actions, the looks of horror and bewilderment involuntarily crossed the faces of the family members. The events that unfolded before them tested their perceptions of morality and relationships within their social circle. They turned to Merrill herself for clarification, expecting her to explain. Merrill, who was the center of everyone's attention, rushed to her justification. Her words sounded strained and uncertain as she claimed that circumstances had forced her to do so and that she had no other choice. This attempt to justify herself only added spice to the situation, as her every word was examined under the microscope of the family court, where each family member tried to understand and evaluate the dilemma from the point of view of their own beliefs and moral principles. In this tense discussion, Merrill began to defend her position, arguing that punishment was necessary to maintain discipline in the house. She argued that without strict measures, it was impossible to maintain order among the servants. Grace, however, standing on the opposite side of the argument, expressed a very different opinion. She emphasized that she never resorted to physical punishment of her servants, and yet they obeyed her orders unconditionally, the only exception being Merrill. In the midst of the heated argument, Grace suddenly noticed the maids, who were still in the room, filled with tears. With surprise, she asked why they had not yet left the manor, for she had previously ordered them to leave. At that moment, Katia, one of the maids, found the strength to speak up and explain the situation. She admitted to Grace with deep regret and guilt that she herself had made the decision to leave them, despite Grace's orders to leave. Katia explained that she felt responsible for the maids and felt that she should have kept a better eye on them, so she took responsibility for their mistakes. Katia's confession brought a new twist to the story. Her willingness to take the blame for what happened and to protect the other maids from the consequences caused a wave of emotion and prompted reflection on the meaning of responsibility and compassion within this household. Grace, standing in front of her father and the whole family, emphasized her position with dignity. She pointed out that even if she chose to punish the maid, it would be her unquestionable right as heir to the duchy. Grace did not stop there and continued her speech campaign against the current state of affairs in their home, pointing out that such incidents with servants had not occurred in her mother's presence. She hinted that her father could exercise more care and wisdom in the selection of servants, thus maintaining the order and harmony that had prevailed in the house under her mother. At the very peak of her speech, Grace boldly expressed a thought that had probably been brewing in her heart for a long time. She stated that she realized that her father had never wanted her to be his daughter. These words, full of pain and disappointment, exposed the deep emotional gulf between father and daughter. The father's response was not long in coming. He, unable to contain his emotions, shouted at Grace and ordered her to shut up. This moment was the culmination of the tension that had been building up between Grace and her father. In his cry, all the accumulated misunderstandings and alienation separating father and daughter were concentrated. This scene, full of drama and emotional tension, exposed the complex relationships in the family, where the struggle for power, respect, and understanding leads to conflicts and ruptures. Grace, despite the tense atmosphere and her father's earlier shouting, continued to express her thoughts with unwavering confidence. She stated that among all the descendants of the Winston family, no one compares to her, as she was the one with the unique ability to hold the enemy empire in a state of fear and respect. Grace emphasized her role as an unwavering guardian and protector of her home, thus asserting her unrivaled importance to the Winston family. The Duke, confronted with the unshakable certainty and clarity of Grace's arguments, found himself confronted with the necessity of recognizing her rightness. Deep down, he realized that Grace was indeed the unwavering force that could be a worthy protector and continuer of the glorious traditions of their family. Her unique qualities and ability to strike fear into the hearts of her enemies made her the perfect person to lead and protect the Winston family in the future. This moment was a turning point in their relationship, when the Duke, perhaps for the first time, was able to fully realize and appreciate Grace's role and importance in the destiny of their family. The Duke's recognition of her worth and role in the Winston family emphasized the beginning of a new era in their relationship, where Grace was no longer just a daughter, but a key figure on whom the hopes and expectations of the entire family rested. In one moment filled with sudden tension, Milena suddenly turned to Meryl with an order from which silence hung in the air. She demanded that Meryl apologize to Grace, as if testing her strength and loyalty. The situation gained momentum when Meryl, whose heart was seized with fear of the Duchess's will, did not have the courage to confront her. So, with a deep sense of submission, she knelt down before Grace in token of her remorse and desire to atone. But Grace, whose position was strengthened not only by her own will, but also by Milena's support, did not find it in herself to accept Meryl's apology so easily. There was displeasure in her eyes, and the words slid across the room as she announced that Meryl would have to seek forgiveness not from her but from Alyona, adding weight to her decision and emphasizing the seriousness of the situation. At that moment, Grace's gaze slid around the room, stopping at the maids she had earlier decided to send away. Apparently impressed by what had happened and wanting to emphasize her superiority and mercy, she allowed them to stay. Nevertheless, there was a stern warning in her words. From now on, they were to behave more humbly to avoid such unpleasant incidents. Grace's gesture not only emphasized her authority over the situation, but also served as a reminder to everyone present that even the slightest act of defiance would not be ignored or punished. In an atmosphere filled with the subtle scent of pre-evening freshness and anticipation, Milena turned to Grace with a slight smile, earnestly inviting her to join the family dinner. This gesture of disposition and openness was undoubtedly intended to strengthen ties and build trust between them. Grace, deep in thought, realized that she had a unique chance to get to know Katia better. This figure is shrouded in secrets and multifaceted stories that Grace has sought to uncover to see if Katia aspires to be the heir to the duchy. When it came time for dinner, the room was filled with the rustle of fabrics, creaking furniture, and muffled voices, creating a special evening cozy. But amidst a richly set table laden with exquisite dishes, Grace noticed crab legs, a dish that she, like her father, had never been attracted to. Without the slightest desire to touch this food, she gently pushed it away from her, as if the gesture might discreetly convey her personal preference without further ado. At the same moment, Milena, as if wanting to smooth over any misunderstanding and bring clarity to the events that had occurred earlier, apologized for Meryl's behavior with grace and delicacy. The promise to take charge of her upbringing sounded not only like a plan for the future, but also like a guarantee that such troubles would be avoided, thus restoring order and harmony between all the participants in this unexpected evening. Katia, like a spark in the night, awakened a new twist in the conversation by politely requesting a favor for Milena. Her words carried a hidden depth, gently pointing to unresolved issues within the family circle. Noting that her father always supports Milena's opinions, Katia unobtrusively exposed to Grace her thoughts on how deep the roots of the Duke's excessive affection for Katia's mother may be, making her wonder about the impact of that love on family relationships. Next, Katia, undaunted by her hope for understanding and support, expressed her admiration for Grace and her aspiration to become like her, the epitome of the lady she sees in Grace. This revelation of Katia's aspirations gave the conversation a special warmth and sincerity, for the desire to emulate someone you truly admire is the highest form of praise. In response to these words, Grace, the epitome of modesty and self-irony, easily dispelled illusions about herself as the ideal lady. This moment of sharing and feelings between Grace and Katia added depth and versatility to their relationship, allowing each of them to see and accept the other from a new perspective. A heavy atmosphere hung in the room as Katia, with a palpable frustration in her voice, began her apology. The words flowed from her lips involuntarily, but with a sincere hope of understanding. She admitted that perhaps her words hadn't sounded the way she intended, and it wasn't her intention at all to claim a desire to outdo Grace. Rather, her deepest desire was that those around her should see in her a nobility and dignity comparable to Grace's own. That admission loaded the air with even more tension, as if each word increased the distance between them. Grace, for her part, did not let this moment go unnoticed. With a noble desire to set things right, she shared her thoughts, bringing the essence of true nobility before Katia. Grace emphasized that the greatness and nobility of an individual does not lie in impeccable knowledge and adherence to etiquette. Nobility, she believes, comes from within and is defined not by formalities, but by depth of soul and sincerity of intentions. These words, full of wisdom and understanding, were meant not only to comfort Katia, but also to remind her of the true values that make one truly honorable. Thus, in this emotionally rich exchange, both ladies tried to find a way to understand each other's thoughts. After the tense exchange settled down, Katia made the decision to sit down, realizing that her cunning plan was not having the desired effect. At that moment, through the thin veil of disappointment, her face reflected a deep inner recognition of her own mistakes. It was the moment when the intrigue she had so carefully woven crumbled before her, leaving only the remnants of unrealized hopes. Grace, for her part, was deep in thought as she watched Katia. At that moment, she realized that Katia was a much more complex and interesting person than she had originally thought. In the back of her mind, Grace caught a note of respect for her rival, recognizing her as a worthy opponent who could surprise and delight with her unpredictability and ingenuity. Suddenly, diffusing the situation, his father intervened in the conversation by suddenly reminding everyone present of the imminent arrival of Katia's birthday. It was as if this remark shed some light on the situation, reminding us that life flows on despite petty quarrels and disagreements. The upcoming celebration was a reminder that time is inexorable, and every day brings new opportunities for reconciliation, understanding, and strengthening of relations between people, even if the day before it seemed that differences were insurmountable. The moment her father curiously asked Katia about her birthday wishes, the atmosphere in the room was filled with anticipation for a moment. Katia's gaze involuntarily slid toward Grace, and she began to talk about how she had once had the opportunity to see Grace's magnificent library. These words sounded with a certain note of envy and admiration at the same time, because Grace's collection of books was known for its exclusivity and extensiveness, becoming a cherished dream of many nobles. Katia started to express her desire to possess such books, but suddenly sensing her own audacity, she faltered, adding that she had no right to take the books from Grace. This moment reflected Katia's internal struggle between desire and awareness of her own limitations, which gave her words a special sincerity and vulnerability. To the surprise of everyone present, including Katia herself, Grace, overcoming any possible hard feelings and disagreements that may have been building up between them up to that point, suddenly declared that Katia could have the entire library. The decision was so unexpected that for a moment the room was silent. This moment was a testimony to the true nobility of Grace's soul, capable of generous acts to achieve her goals. Grace showed not only her nobility, but also her willingness to make concessions to maintain good relations, even if it meant giving up something important to herself. Such an act of grace reflected a deep wisdom and understanding that relationships between people matter far more than material things, even when it comes to such a priceless treasure as books. The father turned to Katia again to ask if she wanted anything else, perhaps some special gift or wish that he could fulfill. Katia, immersed in her own thoughts and feelings, apathetically replied that she had already gotten far more than she could have expected from this day. Her words sounded melancholy and left a feeling of unspoken gratitude and simultaneous loss in this new world. Unwilling to see the atmosphere of the house so oppressed, Grace, like a ray of sunshine in a dark kingdom, introduced a note of cheerfulness into the dialogue and suggested a holiday. The suggestion made her father suspicious, for it wasn't every day that Grace offered to celebrate for no apparent reason. Grace was quick to dispel his doubts, however, explaining that she wanted to throw a party for a reason, but in honor of Kadia's first birthday, which she was celebrating with their family. It was to be not just a party, but a day filled with meaning and warmth, reminiscent of a debut, an introduction to a new life where she was destined to be a beloved daughter. In this instant and unpredictable intrigue where every move could change the balance of power, Kadia felt like the least influential figure. Her reaction to Grace's words was restrained, but deep down she clearly felt that she was losing in a game whose purpose was only to surround her with care and love. This moment was a turning point not only for Kadia but for the entire family, where each member struggled to find their place and a way to express their feelings. As Kadia's last words dissolved into thin air, the dining room fell into a deep silence for a moment, as if time itself had stopped, giving everyone a chance to digest what they had heard. This silence did not last long, for Milena suddenly and unexpectedly expressed her support for Grace's idea. This gesture of support was the catalyst that helped to overcome the last doubts. Kadia, sensing the general mood, also gently added that she would not be opposed to such a celebration. Her agreement was important, for the feast was proposed in her honor, and it was her opinion that could be decisive. Grace, whose idea was now accepted by all, left the dining room with grace and a sense of accomplishment, like a victorious woman. She walked with her head held high, full of determination and confidence that the path she had chosen was the right one. However, in the privacy of her room, Grace was confronted with a question from Aliona, who, worried about the family's well-being, didn't understand why Grace continued to act in a way that might annoy their father, the Duke. Grace didn't hesitate to reply that her purpose was not to serve or seek her father's approval. She stated that every day of her life was a struggle for her own strength and independence. This recognition was more than just words. It was a reflection of Grace's deep convictions and her unyielding will to develop and assert herself in this complex world. In the quiet solitude of her study, surrounded by a silence that was only occasionally broken by the whisper of the wind outside the window, Grace leaned over her desk, concentrating on her pen. She was absorbed in a task that required not only attention but all the wisdom and determination she had accumulated over the years. Years full of hard work, aspirations, and dreams have not been in vain. They have infused Grace with enough strength and power to stand strong and fight back against any challenges. This inner strength was not just a gift of fate, but the fruit of tireless striving and labor, the goal of which was to acquire the ability to defend not only himself, but also his beliefs. In this letter, which she was now composing, Grace poured forth all her determination and will to resist. She realized that without the ability to defend herself, without strength and power, all her efforts would be meaningless. With each word scrawled on paper, she put a piece of herself, her experience, and her hopes for a future where her voice would be heard and her actions would be appreciated. With confidence and unshaken faith in the justice of her cause, she ordered her trusted messenger to send this letter at once to the house of Count Luxon. The move was not just a formality or another message. It was a statement of willingness to stand up for her principles, a challenge to the circumstances that were trying to rob her of what she had been working toward for so long. There was a fire burning in Grace's heart, and that fire was now transferred to the pages of a letter, ready to travel a long journey to reach the heart and mind of Count Luxon. Grace, a woman of indomitable spirit and strong will, has always been convinced that she alone holds the key to her well-being and safety. There was no room for doubt in her heart. She was the forger of her own destiny, and her decisions and actions served as the cornerstone of her existence. This fundamental principle of Grace's life has allowed her to not only get through many challenges, but to stay true to her beliefs and goals. When Valyria, the other key figure in the story, was handed a letter from Grace, the atmosphere was filled with anticipation. The contents of this message became a source of inspiration and confidence for Valerie. Opening the envelope, she couldn't contain the smile that slowly but inevitably blossomed on her face. In every word, every sentence of the letter from Grace, Valerie saw a reflection of the same steadfastness and ingenuity she herself cherished. Grace, with her unrivaled ability to strategize and plan, had again proved her cunning and foresight. Realizing that she had a new page of collaboration in front of her, filled with promise and opportunity, Valerie immediately set to work. She requested the paperwork to draw up the contract, anticipating the start of a new joint venture with Grace. This decision was driven not only by admiration for Grace's intelligence and ingenuity, but also by confidence in the successful future of their joint endeavor. Valerie ordered the best fabrics to be prepared, anticipating that she would soon place a major order. This gesture was no mere formality. It was a demonstration of a willingness and desire to invest in the future they both sought to build together. She anticipated beginning work on a project that would not only strengthen their mutual position, but also provide a foundation for continued prosperity and success. On the eve of the grandiose celebration, which promised to become a landmark event in social life, Valyria began preparations with genuine enthusiasm. She knew that at this celebration, all eyes would be on Grace, who was not only a trendsetter, but also skillfully used her influence to shape fashion trends. Grace, always one step ahead of the rest, planned to appear at the party in an exquisite silk dress that would surely be the object of everyone's adoration. The move was ingenious in its simplicity. Presenting Grace in a silk outfit would inevitably cause a wave of admiration among the aristocracy, causing them to aspire to similar outfits. The consequence of this turn of events will be an increase in demand for silk, which will undoubtedly lead to an increase in prices for this luxurious material, the cost of which at that time was unreasonably low. Grace, like a true strategist, used her influence and authority to not only emphasize her unparalleled taste, but also to make a significant impact on the fabric market. Valyria, realizing the scale of the upcoming event and its potential consequences for the fashion industry, approached the preparation with great care and attention. She realized that Grace's success at the party could be the key to their joint endeavors, as well as helping their business flourish. Everything had been thought through, from the choice of fabrics to the strategy of presenting the outfit in the best possible light. The castle was abuzz with excitement, every corner filled with anticipation. Servants, nobles, and even the most reticent of the castle's inhabitants gathered together to celebrate Kadia's birthday. This day promised to be a special day, not only for the birthday girl, but for everyone in attendance. There was a spirit of unity in the air, and even Madame Muriel, known for her stern temper and tendency to quarrel with Grace, forgot for a time her resentments. A temporary peace was declared in honor of the upcoming celebration, and it was like a small miracle performed in anticipation of an important event. Kadia and Grace, the two main characters in this story, were on opposite sides of the holiday rush. Since Grace had stopped showing up at family dinners, their paths had hardly crossed. This estrangement might have seemed strange, given their early relationship, but each was absorbed in her own tasks and experiences. Grace, always strong and independent, seemed to have chosen the path of solitude, which at the same time gave her freedom and the opportunity for self-actualization. However, soon fate was preparing an unexpected turn for Grace. Princess Kadia, on a day when the whole castle was expecting a celebration, made a statement that came as a surprise to everyone. The princess appointed Grace her personal guardian. It was not just an appointment, it was a sign of special trust and respect. It was the highest honor for Grace, for such a title was not given to everyone, and it was a recognition of her personal qualities, strength, and loyalty. Moreover, the princess's decision had deep political implications. After all, Grace's appointment as personal guardian was a clear sign that the princess would support Grace in the struggle for the succession to the duchy. It was a bold and highly significant gesture that promised to change the course of the history of their family and perhaps the entire duchy. It was not only an endorsement, but also a hint that Grace had the necessary qualities for great things and that her future was inextricably linked to the future of Kadia herself and the entire house. Suddenly, there was a ringing laughter of the princess, which was full of sincerity and warmth. Her Majesty, with a twinkle in her eyes, turned to Grace with admiration, emphasizing that the fame of the guard's unsurpassed beauty did not seem to be an exaggeration. The princess's words carried not only flattering compliments, but also a recognition of deep respect for Grace, who was considered so charming that to see her at least once in a lifetime became a kind of cultural achievement, without which life seemed incomplete. Grace, for her part, modestly brushed off such eulogies, asking the princess not to shower her with undue praise. However, the princess, seeing in Grace not only beauty but also wisdom, decided to entrust her with a task of deep meaning and importance. Strange and disturbing events began to occur in the capital city: the disappearance of people with scarlet hair. This hair color, according to long-standing beliefs, boded ill for the imperial family, and many believed that the disappearances were related to these superstitions. The princess, possessing not only beauty but also insight, felt that Grace was the most suitable candidate to investigate this dark secret. The task was not an easy one. It was necessary not only to find out who or what was behind these disappearances, but also to understand how these events were connected to ancient legends and what their true purpose was. It was a real challenge that required not only courage and determination, but also the ability to see beyond the superficial picture of the world, to penetrate into the very essence of events.